Hey guys, so I don't have a script prepared for today's video, so this isn't going to be very concise. I don't have an awful lot of time to make a video, so I'm just gonna riff with this one and do it off the cuff. I wanted to just chime in about this debate that's emerged in fan circles, Star Trek Discovery, and whether it is in fact canon. And the reason this has come up is because in the final episode of the animated comedy series called Star Trek Lower Decks, there's this multiverse stuff going on, and there's like a Klingon and a Klingon ship, and they're they're transformed into what appears to be an alternate universe version of a Klingon from Discovery, basically, and a Klingon ship from Discovery's first two seasons. You remember the Kling Orcs, as we used to call them? They changed the makeup of the Klingons in Star Trek Discovery. Of course, the Klingon makeup had changed multiple times. I mean, the original series in the 60s, the makeup was very crude, but then they they made it the way they wanted it to be in Star Trek the Motion Picture. They gave them the bumpy head, the ridges, the forehead ridges, and then they evolved that over the course of the original series movies and then into the next generation. And they finally settled on how the Klingon appearance should be, and we all accepted that. So you can understand why there was an evolution in the design of the Klingons, because they were perfecting the makeup, but it had been perfected, and therefore there was no reason in 2017 for Discovery to come along and change that so radically as they did, but they did, and that wasn't too popular. Um, and as a result of it not being too popular, they eventually changed it again in Strange New Worlds. So Strange New Worlds is a spin-off of Star Trek Discovery, and they went back to the Klingon makeup that we know. And the explanation after the fact, the sort of retcon explanation for why the Klingorks looked the way they did, is because that this was a different group of sort of an offshoot, a sort of I guess a subspecies of Klingons from another part of the Empire. And I guess that you can sort of write it off that way. You can headcanon your way around these things, and that was that. Um, and we've seen, Star Trek Picard, for example, is connected to Strange New Worlds and to Star Trek Discovery, because we've seen the Captain Pike Discovery Strange New Worlds Enterprise in a hologram in one of the episodes of Picard season one, and so they are connected. But we see that the Klingons in Star Trek Picard, because of Worf, he's got the normal makeup that we know, so he's not a Klingork. They didn't update it for that. So I think what's going on is there's more than one type of Klingon in the Prime timeline. And that's all I think is happening in this Lower Decks episode, okay? I think what happened was it was a visual gag. They transformed this Klingon into a Klingork, and it was just done not to try to make a statement about whether Discovery is connected to the Prime timeline or not, but just to simply say that, hey, this is just another variant of Klingon that this guy is being transformed into, and it's just a sort of a wink and a nod to Star Trek Discovery. So the theory going around in some fan circles, and I think it is wishful thinking, is that because this Klingon was changed into a Kling Orc, basically, that must mean that they're saying that Discovery is taking place in an alternate timeline outside of the Prime timeline. And therefore, Discovery must not be canon anymore. Now, neither of these things are actually confirmed. Neither of these things are necessarily the case. Firstly, there's a moment in the episode where the Cerritos gets turned into a Sovereign class starship. So no one is seriously suggesting that Sovereign class starships are not canon, right? Do you know what I mean? By the same logic. But also there's a total misunderstanding for some reason of what canon is. Okay, canon is canon. Canon is whatever is on screen. It's not the video games, it's not all the novels and the books and the comic books and everything, but it's everything else. And canon also is the Kelvin timeline. canon is also Star Trek Discovery. Star Trek Discovery was considered a visual reboot, but believe it or not, even though it doesn't look anything like Star Trek before in the early 23rd century, it is actually connected to the original series. It doesn't look like it. It doesn't feel like it, but it is. Likewise, Strange New Worlds, even though the ship is different, the actors are all different, right? The design of things is different to the original series. It is apparently a prequel, a canonical, connected prequel to the original series. It doesn't make any sense to me. To me, it doesn't feel intuitively like it is, but it is because Paramount says it is. They are the custodians of the franchise, and if they make the rules, I wish it was otherwise, but that's the case. Okay, so this is the thing. It's like the Kelvin timeline is canon because it's on screen, and it is merely one universe within a multiverse of timelines in Star Trek. And this is the thing, alternate timelines are not necessarily non-canon. This is the complexity. I don't know why some people are kind of struggling with this now. For example, we have a main universe, the prime timeline, where most of Star Trek's chronology, Star Trek history takes place. Okay. But we also have alternate timelines within that canon. For example, the Mirror Universe. The Mirror Universe is canon. It's just not the usual universe where Star Trek takes place. But there's been overlap between the Mirror Universe and the Prime Timeline. Actually, you might say that the Prime Timeline and the Mirror Universe are adjacent to each other. But at any rate, Discovery fits within canon. So again, I just want to, I don't want to be that guy who has to come out and go, actually, sir, let me tell you what canon really means. But I have to be that guy, which is what does canon mean? Canon means official live action Star Trek. That's simply what canon means. And then within canon, you have different timelines. So the question is not necessarily what's canon and what's not canon. It's whether or not Discovery is still within the prime timeline. And does this particular event, this multiverse anomaly that took hold of this Klingon in Lower Decks, does that moment suggest that Discovery is now not in the prime timeline? No, not necessarily. Okay, because all it means is that a Klingon got transformed into an earlier version of a Klingon, into a Klingork from the 23rd century. That's all that means. I mean, to further underline my point here, there's even a scene in the episode where the Klingons get transformed into the proto-Klingons that we saw Worf get transformed into in the Next Generation episode Genesis. And instead, people are looking at this, I think, a little bit with a bias, and I can understand it, because they don't like Discovery, just like myself. I don't like Discovery either. I never liked the show. And they would like to believe that their headcanon is now true. I mean, in my headcanon, none of New Trek is canon. But to me, it's just the first five live action series and the animated series in the first 10 movies. To me, Star Trek basically ended with Enterprise in 2005. And everything since then, the JJ movies and all the subsequent TV series we've had, there's something else. Now, the fan base is large, and there's a lot of people who disagree, and there's people who love all the new shows as well, and that's fine. And in their headcanon, it's all good, right? Personally, I look at Lower Decks, and I see something that is also unrecognizable. And I have no doubt that Lower Decks has told some decent, entertaining episodes of science fiction. But I can't connect with Lower Decks personally because, as a fan, I don't believe that Star Trek is a comedy. Star Trek can do light-hearted episodes, but I don't believe it's a Rick and Morty style borderline satire parody of Star Trek. It's very postmodern, you know, when a show becomes self-aware to devolve into almost borderline pastiche. You know, it's too self-aware. It is I don't believe that Star Trek should be a comedy. Right? It's supposed to be a serious thing. There can be lighthearted episodes. There can be horror episodes. There can be hard sci-fi episodes. There can be time travel episodes. There can be all different genres within it. But I don't believe that Star Trek should be a comedy. But that's me. And I have a feeling I'm probably in the minority these days. There's a lot of people like Lower Decks, and it ran for 5 seasons. It had its own dedicated corner of the fan base that seemed to really appreciate it. And I've no doubt that it made some very clever, deep cut references to canon, and it had very meaningful moments to people. Great. It's not my bag. If you like it, that's absolutely fine. The same goes for Discovery. That show has a dedicated fan base of people who really liked it. I think it did turn off a lot of the main fan base, and there are people who would very much like to see this resign to some other place outside of the Prime timeline. But what I'm saying to you is that this is not confirmation. It could happen. It could happen eventually that it gets legitimately removed from the Prime timeline and maybe even legitimately decanonized. But to do something like that, it would be messy because it would have an impact on Strange New Worlds, and it would have an impact on Star Trek Picard. And there would have to be clear lines of delineation, you know, what's canon, what is not canon, what is Prime, what is not Prime. And you know, it's all canon technically. It's just different universes, and there is overlap. There is some connection between the Kelvin timeline and the Prime timeline because there was a split apart, of course. There has been references made to the Kelvin timeline in Star Trek Discovery. So, you know, I guess it ultimately comes back to what is Star Trek for you and what is not Star Trek for you. And for me, it's really the first 5 live action series, the animated series, and those first 10 movies. And anything else after that, if New Trek occasionally produces a decent episode, you know, I'll praise it. I'll enjoy that episode for what it is. But I do feel that modern Trek is just something else. But it doesn't really matter necessarily how I feel about it, because officially the studio has determined that it's all canon. There's nothing that I can do about it. And just to come back to the beginning, I just don't see how this particular moment in Lower Decks that everybody's going on about, I don't see how that's enough to decanonize Star Trek Discovery, or the bare minimum make the claim that Discovery no longer takes place in the Prime timeline. So anyway, sorry if that video was a bit waffly and I was just rambling on there, but I did just want to throw in my oar into the water here and say that, just sort of counterbalance some of the stuff that's been going around. So yeah. I really do. I just don't want to throw a whole lot of cold water on this, because believe me, I would love for them to come out and go, yeah, Discovery's not canon, you know. But there you go. It's sort of like I would love for the last few seasons of Doctor Who to also be decanonized, but that isn't going to happen, right? I'd like everything up to, you know, the end of Capaldi's era. After that, I would love that to just erased. But anyway, it's not going to happen. And I'm not going to engage in wishfulness. Things are the way they are. Unfortunately, they are not any other way. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.